Hi, welcome to this Blender video tutorial entitled Ambient Occlusion. Another method for lighting a Blender scene is called ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is a simulated, soft global illumination. To demonstrate Blender's ambient occlusion, I've placed in my scene a model sculpture and a base placed on a flat plane. As I've used this model for all of the other lighting tutorials, note that in this case I've removed all of the materials and textures. To this I've added 4 default UV sphere objects. The sphere and the sculpture objects are placed slightly above the plane object to heighten the ambient occlusion effect. In the world editor, I am using the default horizon, zenith, and ambient colors. I've split my 3D editor into 2 windows, placing the UV image editor on the right, and I've set the render output to display the rendered image in this UV image editor. I'll render the scene. As the scene has no lighting objects, the default gray sky is displayed, leaving the sculpture, base, and UV spheres in silhouette. Ambient occlusion rendering does not make use of any of the Blender lamp objects. Rather, it relies on the settings located in the World Background Editor. With the World Background Editor open, I'll checkmark the Ambient Occlusion checkbox and render the scene. The ambient occlusion calculation samples the object's faces as seen through the camera image plane and determines which faces are in front of other faces and shadows the rendered pixels accordingly. This creates a faked sort of three-dimensional shadowing effect that is simple yet powerful. It is ideal for test rendering of animations as it indicates the shadow dimensionality of the objects, yet renders rather quickly. The color for the shadows is derived from the ambient color swatch, which by default is set to black. Here I will change the ambient color swatch to a medium blue, and then render the scene. Now the shadowing is blue in color. I'll set the ambient color back to black and render the scene. The admixture of the default white diffuse material object color to the default black ambient color used to color the occluded shadows is set by the Add drop-down box and the factor number. I'll set the factor to 0.5 and render the scene. Here only half of the default material color of the objects is used, making their shapes appear darker in the rendering. I'll set the factor back to 1. Changing the blend from add to multiply simply colors the objects and the shadows solidly with the ambient color. The world background is displayed in the ambient occlusion rendering. By default, this is a dark gray. I'll select the Blend Sky checkbox, and I'll make the horizon color a light blue, with blue equals 0.8, red equals 0.3, and green equals 0.3. I'll set the zenith color to white. I'll then render the scene. Now the ambient occlusion is set against a background gradient of color. The ambient occlusion by default uses ray traced method for determining the placement of the shadows. We can see this in the Gather panel. To use the ray trace ambient occlusion, both the ray trace button here must be active, and the ray trace checkbox in the Render Shading panel must also be checked, which it normally is by default. The ray trace controls are similar to the ray trace shadow controls available on the point, sun, area, and spot lamp objects. An alternative to using ray traced ambient occlusion is to use approximate ambient occlusion. Here I will press the approximate button and render the scene. The approximate method for ambient occlusion is, as the name implies, not quite as accurate as the ray trace method, but is generally much quicker to render, especially if the number of samples is set to the default 0. Increasing the number of passes decreases the shadowing effect. I'll select Render Slot 2 and switch back to Ray Trace and render the scene. I'll press my J key to display the difference between the default Ray Trace rendering and the default Approximate rendering. Ray Trace, Approximate. Personally, I think the Approximate looks better. I'll select the Approximate method. A substitute for ambient occlusion, or perhaps a better way to describe it, a companion for ambient occlusion, is environment lighting. I will uncheck the ambient occlusion checkbox and check the environment lighting checkbox, and then render the scene. With the default values, there's no difference between the ambient occlusion and the environment lighting. Both employ either ray trace or approximate occlusion methods, and the environment lighting uses white as the default object color environment admixture to the black ambient colored shadows. However, the environment lighting panel contains some options for defining where the environment light comes from. I'll change the drop-down box from white to sky color and render the scene. Now the environment lighting comes from the blue sky gradient, giving the objects a similar coloring. The white zenith color on the top and the light blue horizon color below. I'll change the horizon color to a solid red. And I'll change the zenith color to a light blue, with blue equals 0.8, red equals 0.4, and green equals 0.4. I'll then render the scene. Again, the zenith color is on top and the horizon color below, with the ambient color as the shadow color. I'll set the horizon color to black and the zenith color to white. I will then add a texture to the background. I'll use the Water 1 small JPEG image located on my desktop. I'll then render the scene. I'll change the drop-down box from Sky Color to Sky Texture. Sky Texture only works with the Ray Trace occlusion method, so I'll select Ray Trace. I'll go to the Texture panel and change the mapping from the default View to Angle Map, and then render the scene. As you can see, ambient occlusion can produce some interesting render effects without the use of the Blender lamp objects.